I should go ahead and go on record and let you know that when it comes to the 12-team playoff, just because there's 12 teams in the playoff doesn't mean that you have 12 actual contenders there. I have long shared my opinion on this platform that there are only 8, maybe 10 programs across the entire country that are doing the things necessary to legitimately say they are attempting to win the college football playoff national championship every year. But there are other teams that could get into the 12-team playoff and potentially have a shot at winning a national title. Now, I've just told you, I don't think that the teams on the back end are going to be able to do that. But we'll run through them nevertheless. So let's just look at who's going to be there, who the zeitgeist of college football is looking to in 2024 and says, okay, we're going to keep an eye out for these teams. And we're talking about Georgia, of course, who without a doubt should be everyone's preseason number one heading into next year. And I'll explain why here in just a minute. But you've got Georgia, who, if you ask Vegas, are hands down the favorite to win the national title in 2024. Okay? Now, I'm not a betting person, but the people who are and who do it for a living, they seem to think that what the Bulldogs have going on in Athens is simply better than what everybody else has across the country. So there's the Georgia Bulldogs. Alabama must be considered as a contender in 2024. But now the news of Saban retiring changes everything. I'm not saying they're not a contender. I'm saying what we thought was on autopilot is no longer that way. And even if Nick had come back, there are questions at Alabama. Does Jalen Milroe, does he take that big second-year leap? Does he become that quarterback who can do all the intermediate pass game? Can he be more consistent? Will Alabama reload the way they always do? There are always questions. And now they have to have a new head coach, a new person to lead it all. And in case you hadn't put it together, just remember this. Alabama's first SEC game after the announcement that Nick Saban is retiring from Alabama, the first SEC game that Alabama is going to play in 2024 is against the Georgia Bulldogs at night in Tuscaloosa. So if you weren't already amped up for that game, if you didn't think it was already, the knob wasn't already turned to 10, they just cranked that thing on up a little bit more. Ohio State is another team that would have to be considered a contender heading into 2024 because they possess everything I was discussing about Georgia and Alabama. They have the players, they have the talent, they have the buy-in, they have the head coach, they have the coaching staff, they have the recruiting, they have the alignment. So Ohio State's going to have their opportunity. I can't see a scenario where they're not going to make that 12-team playoff. Texas, another school, depending on where you look, some people are going to say that Texas is the number 2 team heading into next season. Could be. Depends on how the rosters ultimately shake out here and really what you think about Quinn Ewers. So Texas is somebody that's going to be there. And I think they fall into that group of 6 to 8 teams that legitimately have an opportunity to win it every year. Oregon, Dan Lanning, we just talked about him. I think Oregon is a school that you're going to see in a lot of the preseason top 10s. But I do believe that Oregon has everything that I've talked about already. And that's going to put them in position to win a national championship. Dan Lanning is still a young coach. He's still learning. He's still making mistakes. Maybe that would be the impediment to Oregon actually winning it in 24. They're definitely going to be a contender. Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin, everyone's favorite internet troll who really couldn't be more different in real life. He is working college football free agency as we know it right now to a T. He has turned over his roster. He has assessed it and said, we have deficiencies here. Let's try to fix it, and let's give it our best shot. We're going to score points, and now we're going to try to play defense. Maybe Ole Miss is a team that should be considered a contender here in 24. I think they absolutely are. I would not put Ole Miss in that group of 6 to 8 annually, but I think that they're certainly going to be a threat to make the playoff, and they're certainly going to have an opportunity to show us what they're all about in 24. Notre Dame. Now, I do not care for Notre Dame in any way. I do not have faith that Notre Dame is going to win anything of consequence anytime soon. With that said, they have good things happening at South Bend. They are still Notre Dame, and if they play well, there's a very good shot that they're going to be in this 12-team playoff. So I think you have to include them when you're listing off teams that could potentially be there. Penn State. Now, this one was the hardest one for me to include. I don't have any faith in James Franklin. Penn State was grossly overrated this year in what was a grossly overrated Big Ten conference. But they are still a very talented team. And they could very well make their way into this 12-team playoff in 24. Now, Clemson is another team. And this one, when we start talking about the ACC and the Big 12, you have to take into account what those conferences are, what they're going to be, what we think they're going to be moving forward. And Clemson is a school that I still think deserves consideration for being able to make this 12-team playoff and be a contender. Do I believe that they are now, today, among the 6 to 8 programs that are actually trying to win the national championship? I do not. And it's because of the choices being made by their head coach, Dabo Swinney. But there's a very real possibility that they're still going to be able to go out and win the ACC next year. Now, Georgia, of course, kicks off the season against Clemson. Consider this. If Georgia goes out and plasters Clemson, they're going to be a double-digit favorite heading into that game. If Georgia goes out and destroys Clemson, think about what happened to Oregon a couple of years ago. Then Clemson manages to go through the ACC schedule and win the conference and is rewarded with a bye. But something happens along the way, and Georgia doesn't win the SEC next year. How's that fair? That Clemson might have a bye and Georgia might have to play in that first round. Without running down the rabbit trail of everything that I might not like about the 12-team playoff moving forward, just something to put in your hat and consider. So the possibility is there. Clemson could make the playoff if they win the ACC. But the ACC, there are a lot of moving parts over there right now. Florida State is another school. Depending on how they reload, they could be right there and win the conference, and then we don't have this Clemson discussion. There's a lot to be seen there at Florida State, though. We're just going to have to see them do it year after year. The mercenary tactics that they use this year to fill their roster, I just personally don't feel are sustainable year over year. And we saw what happens at the end of the season when you got a team full of mercenaries and they're not bound to your program. They have no true love or tie to their teammates and what's going on. So we'll see about Florida State. But maybe they end up winning the ACC. For all I know, Miami might figure it out, find somebody that can play quarterback and win the ACC. I couldn't bring myself to put them on here as a contender, though, because I've seen Miami under Mario Cristobal so far. They're young and talented, but we'll see. I didn't feel comfortable including them. Now, of course, we have to mention this year's national champion, Michigan. They're going to be in a power conference. But let's be real about what's going on at Michigan right now. They're losing everybody. They're going to lose their head coach if I had to place a wager on it. I don't think Michigan's going to be anywhere near the same team next year that they were this year. But just in deference to the reigning champion, we'll include Michigan in this list as a contender for the 25 title. The team they beat, the Washington Huskies. Kellen DeBoer's got that team rolling. We'll see if he's still at Washington come this time next year. They are replacing a lot of people, but moving into a new conference, a new style of play, they could very well put themselves in position inside the Big Ten to be considered to make this playoff. So Washington, I think, is a viable consideration as a contender for the title here in 2025. LSU has to be listed as a contender, I think. In the new look SEC, and especially now given what we know about Alabama, LSU has as good a shot as, say, Ole Miss would to win the SEC or play for a title and make their way into this 12-team format. And the bottom line about any of these SEC schools, okay, is that if you let them in to the tournament, they win. They win. History shows it. They're the rare exception. But on the whole, when you let an SEC team into a playoff, they win. So it could be LSU is that team you might not be thinking about. Ole Miss is that team you might not be considering top tier. Could be Missouri. Could be Auburn. If they mess around to get in there, you have to think they're dangerous. But of all those schools I just mentioned, LSU is the one out of the SEC that has the alignment, has all those sorts of things, has the head coach. They are getting a new defensive coordinator this year, so there will be some turnover there. They have to play better defense, but I think they deserve a mention as a team that could possibly make that 12-team playoff and therefore, by definition, be considered a contender. Now, the last team I'd like to mention would be Utah. Beginning life in the Big 12, take what you know about Utah football when you think about the Utes. The fact that they have Cam Rising coming back at quarterback, he's going to be healthy as far as we know. Having a proven quarterback with experience is worth a lot. Ask Tennessee 2022 to 2023 how much a quarterback with experience is worth. So Utah could win the Big 12. They could find their way into this playoff. And because of the kind of program that Utah is, they would be a tough out. So I think they have to be mentioned. But as I said at the very beginning of this, out of all these teams I've mentioned, there are only going to be a consistent 4 to 8 that you're going to think about every year that has a real chance to win the national title. And moving forward, especially now with the news of today, with Nick Saban stepping down as head coach at the University of Alabama, that field, maybe it becomes one less. Only time will tell. But one thing that we know for certain right now is that the Georgia Bulldogs are the favorite to win the national title moving into this coming season. There's a good reason for that, and it starts with Carson Beck at quarterback. Beck is the highest graded, according to PFF, returning quarterback in college football heading into the 2024 season. Threw for almost 4,000 yards this year, over 20 touchdowns, under 10 interceptions, I believe it was. And if you watched Georgia football, you know that at least 5 of those were just bounce of the ball picks. So Carson Beck, by virtually any measure, has to be considered a Heisman favorite heading into 2024, has the very real potential to play himself into position of being a top 5 NFL draft pick the following year. He brings back experience inside the conference, the toughest conference in the country. and he has a fire to win. Oh, and let's not forget, he's at the University of Georgia, where he's surrounded by a myriad of weapons, regardless of what they've lost to the NFL draft, to graduation, or even to the transfer portal. Georgia is sitting pretty heading into 2024 from a roster perspective. Now, they're going to miss the key players that are departing. Let's make no mistake. Brock Bowers, Ladd McConkey, Cedric Van Pran, those are big names. They will be missed. But all is not lost. Where Georgia had deficiencies, at least on paper, they were aggressive in trying to remedy those holes. If you look at the running back room, which was decimated by injury last year, they have done work both through recruiting and through the transfer portal to shore that space up. And they bring in Trevor Etienne, who is an all-purpose back who can do a little bit of everything, gives Georgia the kind of thing that they haven't had the last couple of years, and with a little bit more of a home run threat from the running back position. And he has SEC experience. So Georgia's in good shape there. You might talk about the wide receiver room. You're losing your top two pass catchers, but you're bringing back depth and tremendous potential inside that room with Dominic Lovett, Ra Thomas, Dylan Bell, who I think should go into 2024 as wide receiver 1 for Carson Beck. Arian Smith returns. We saw flashes from Anthony Evans this year. There are names there, not to mention the freshmen. Now, we all know you can't count on freshmen to come in and make an impact like that, but wide receiver is a position where they might be able to. Nitro Tuggle, Sokovie White. Those are guys that are coming into work. So they have options. And we're not going to skip right past the fact that another area where they knew they were losing people, they went and got people in the transfer portal. So welcome to Athens, London Humphrey. Welcome Colby Young from Miami. Welcome Michael Jackson III from Southern California. There is depth in that room. Beck will not lack for options at the wide receiver position. And on a side note, given the fact that A, you have the top returning quarterback in college football, B, we saw what Mike Bobo and Carson Beck could do on the back half of the season this year, and C, given the running back room is going to have to find its legs, even with the addition of Etienne, they're going to have to sort out the pecking order, the rotation, all those sorts of things. I expect Georgia to throw the ball around the yard a lot in 24. I absolutely expect Carson Beck to go over 4,000 yards. I expect Carson Beck to be closer to 30 touchdowns than 20. I expect him to top 30, if I'm being completely transparent. Georgia's going to toss it around. That's who they're going to be. They're not going to abandon the run. They're going to run the football. But Coach Bobo and Coach Smart, they know where their playmakers are, and they're going to make sure that they get the football. And right now, the majority of those playmakers line up at wide receiver, and I'm not forgetting about the tight ends. You have Oscar Delp returning, Pierce Spurlin, Lawson Lucky. That's your 3 deep right there. You can run 12, you can run 11, you can run 13 personnel. And the freshmen that are coming in look like real players. Again, they're freshmen. They have to work their way in. But Todd Hartley in that tight end room is unlike any other tight end room in the country. And Mike Bobo and Carson Beck will make good use of those weapons. Oscar Delp will have a big year for the University of Georgia. The offensive line's in good shape. We weren't sure. Graduation, transfers, things like that. But at the end of the day, they're essentially going to be returning 4 starters along the offensive line. Now, the center position is a very important one that they're going to have to replace. But when you're bringing back 4 starters, you're bringing back an All-American in Tate Ratledge. You're bringing back a freshman All-American, or someone who's going to be on many preseason SEC lists and All-American watch lists heading into 24, Ernest Green at left tackle. The Georgia offensive line is in good shape, and there's depth there. There was depth there already, which was only buoyed by the recruiting class that just showed up in Athens. Lots of hog mollies. The numbers are good along the offensive line right now for Georgia. And if you look at the defensive side of the ball, there has to be improvement along the defensive line. And, of course, that's already underway. You've had some key returning players announce that they're going to be back in Athens for this year. Nazir Stackhouse among them. And the coaching staff looked at their players and said, well, what can we do to become more dynamic? And they pointed to Michael Williams, had some conversations with the young man and said, you know what, we're going to let you do what you do best. And they're going to take his hand out of the dirt more in 2024, have him in a stand-up position as an outside linebacker, and unleash him on quarterbacks this season. When you pair him with Sam Mpemba, Damon Wilson, Chaz Chambliss, all of a sudden, and occasionally Jalen Walker when you move him over there, all of a sudden Georgia's pass rush goes from a weakness to a strength. Now, if we're talking about linebackers, Georgia has one of the best linebacker rooms in the country. Both the guys that you already know and the guys that you're going to get to know. Smile Munden returns. We all know about C.J. Allen and Raylan Wilson, two guys that got on the field this year as freshmen. And oh, by the way, Jalen Walker can roll back there and play middle linebacker if he needs to. And the recruiting class that Georgia brought in the linebacker room is just insane. The number one player in the country at the position, along with two other blue chip prospects. The depth in the linebacker room at Georgia, let's just say, I can't think of a school across the country that can rival it. And then if you go to the back end, you have Malachi Starks returning at safety, a consensus All-American. We have Janelle Aguero, who was an All-American coming into Georgia. He was a high school All-American coming into Georgia, who saw some action last year, who's going to be in the running for playtime this year. Julian Humphrey announced his return to the Dogs. So that sort of answers one question at corner. And you have Dalen Everett at the other corner with Daniel Harris competing for playing time. Even if Aguero doesn't work out at safety for the Dogs, or one of the other guys that have a little bit more time in back there doesn't answer the bell, as true freshmen, you have the best safety prospect in the country coming in KJ Bolden. Now, you don't want to put everything on KJ and say he's just like Malachi and has the ability to start as a true freshman at Georgia, but it could happen. And oh, by the way, there's Ellis Robinson, the number one player in the country, according to some industry rankings, coming in at corner. So there's depth and talent and playmaking ability all over the back end for the Dogs on defense, not to mention the addition of Andre Evans and DeMello Jones. So there are players everywhere back there. So when you look at who's going to compete to win it all in 2025, I don't think there's any person out there with a brain in their head and two eyeballs that's going to look around the country and say, yeah, there's a squad out there that's better positioned than the University of Georgia heading into the season to claim the national championship in 2025. So can the Dogs reclaim their crown in 2025? I think things set up nicely for them to have every opportunity to get that done. Is the schedule going to be a challenge? Yeah, but it's going to be exciting. As I mentioned, Clemson, that's going to be a great way to kick off the season. And then you have the mega matchup against Alabama at the end of September. Auburn, Florida. They have to go on the road to Texas, on the road to Ole Miss. They still have to play Tennessee. And they're going to finish against an improving Georgia Tech team. But at the end of the day, I don't see how you can argue that anybody is more well-positioned than Georgia to at least start the season as number one. And as Vegas tells us already, they are the betting favorite to win the national title in 2025. So there's a lot happening, both in 2024, the season, and today. Just a quick recap. Nick Saban has announced, or at least told his team, that he plans to retire as head coach at the University of Alabama. The ripple effects of that decision will be felt across the SEC and across college football in 2024. And I'm going to say something that I think I'm going to be the first person to say it. I don't know. I haven't seen anybody else this afternoon. The news broke so late. I haven't looked around anywhere else and gotten takes on Saban's departure. But here's my first take. With Nick Saban deciding to retire as head coach at the University of Alabama, there is a new king of college football, and his name is Kirby Smart. I base this on not only what we've seen over the last 8 seasons in Athens, but the fact that I can back it up. Let's just look at who has the most national titles right now among active head coaches. Nick Saban, reportedly no longer active, had 7. Kirby had 2. Dabo Swinney had 2. Jimbo Fisher 1. Mack Brown 1. We can toss Mack Brown out immediately. Too much age, not in the right situation at North Carolina to really take on the mantle of king of college football right now. Jimbo Fisher, he's out of the sport right now. We don't know when he's going to come back, and based off of what we've seen from him recently, there's no reason to think that he could ever assume that position. As we mentioned, Nick has decided to hang it up at Alabama, so he's out. And he's the guy who has held that position for the last 15 years. Undisputed. You wanted to talk college football and you wanted to go to the source of who was going to shape the game, you talked to Nick Saban. Nick stepping away. That leaves Dabo Swinney in his 2 titles at Clemson and Kirby Smart in his 2 titles back-to-back at the University of Georgia. First, Kirby's titles are more recent. The trajectory of Georgia football is it's straight up. Like, the incline is extremely steep. Compare that to the career arc for Dabo Swinney at Clemson right now. Clemson appeared to be a shell of themselves last year. They simply don't have the players and the roster right now to compete. And given Dabo's choices as far as how he manages his roster, it's hard to think that that situation is going to improve anytime soon without a complete 180 in the way they manage their roster at Clemson right now. So from where I sit, there is only one king of college football. And that new king and the standard for college football in America in 2024 is Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldog football program. So there you have it, friends. We've taken a look at 2024, who's actually going to contend for the title. We've broken the news about Nick Saban and his stepping down. And I have handed Kirby Smart the crown as the new king of college football, heading into a wild new future with conference realignment, with a new playoff system. There can be only one. And that one is Kirby Smart at the University of Georgia. Until next time, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your families, and as always, go Dogs!
Yes, sir! How about them dogs, baby?
So how about them fucking dogs? That's what I told them.